Hello, everybody, and thank you all for listening to this panel. And the subject of today's panel is, what do investors and miners need to be aware of with regards to stakeholder engagement in this post-pandemic world? And joining us today, we have Ludivine Wouters, who's the Managing Director of Latitude Five. We've got Graeme Robertson, who's the Chairman of Intrasia Capital, and Lara Smith, who is the Managing Director of Core Consultants. And my name's Charles Vivian, and I'm a Director at Tavistock Communications, which is a specialized natural resources, financial and corporate communications advisor. So thank you all for joining today, and welcome. And let's jump straight in, if that's okay. Maybe the first question, maybe to Lara. And firstly, I just wanted to check, what in your view are the key issues mining companies will have to contend with in a post-pandemic world from a sort of an ESG and governance perspective?
Yes, Charles, thank you very much for that. So I think, in a post-pandemic world, what we've seen is a lot of supply disruption. So that really does speak to the S in ESG, S being sustainability. And we've seen responses by governments calling for mining companies to diversify their supply chains, and at the same time make sure that as a country, or as sort of resource nationalism, as it were. Now, this was a constant theme prior to the pandemic, and it became more and more pronounced as you first saw at the start of the pandemic, where China shut down, disrupting demand supply chains. And then as China started to recover, we had supply chains disruption in the rest of the world where we couldn't supply. And this really has, I suppose, threatened markets. We see the impact in the car manufacturing industry, where there's literally cars standing waiting for microchips to be put in. And this really does call into question, how do we make supply chains more sustainable? There's been a lot of focus, I would say, on environmental, on governance, but really what the COVID brought into the fore was the issue of sustainability and how we combat that and overcome it.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Lara, especially with sustainability and supply chain. And Graeme, maybe one of the lessons learned from the effects of the pandemic is that the global mining and metals industry must build more resilience and flexibility in its value chain, so from its suppliers to its downstream customers. And so in your view, how do you think this can be achieved?
I think it's a very good question. I think the way it can be achieved is by diversification, where you look at supply chains mainly being diversified. You look at different ways and means of pipelining supply systems into the mining operations. I think that in the actual mining operations, I'm a miner, so I've been mining all my life virtually, and I always look at diversified means of getting your product out into the market. And that means not really following public opinion, but following what you think is correct. And that might flow against the modern interpretations of sustainability to some degree, but it's survivability of the mining operation, which is important. I think the examples are quite good that was just given. I think that look at the Microsoft iPhone 13, deliveries are being held up by 3 to 4 weeks because in Vietnam, some parts are actually, some critical parts are actually manufactured in Vietnam, and manufacturing has been slowed down because of the pandemic. And this has delayed the whole flow of chain. So it would have been wiser for Microsoft to have diversified areas of production rather than single source supply. So I think that's an important way of getting around it.
And Ludivine, just one other question on, I just want to think about sort of employees and communities just for 1 second. Big, obviously a major important part of the whole subject, but how do you think the mining industry's broader responsibility to employees, communities, and society in general has changed in the wake of the pandemic?
Thanks, Charles. I think it's an interesting question. There are really some global trends which are affecting mining in specific ways, but can also, are emerging across a variety of sectors. The first one that strikes me is what's now being dubbed the ESG backlash. And it's really calling into question a lot of the hype that's been going on around ESG, the validity of ESG investment in terms of outcomes and efficiency. We've all seen the colossal debate following the publication of an essay by BlackRock Sustainability's former CIO. So I think one of the elements that's going to shape how stakeholders look at mining as well as other industries is a lot less tolerance for disconnect between glossy reports and siloed realities where community, government, suppliers, employees are important but not core. So I think there's going to be increasing pressure for demonstration of outcomes rather than a lot of reporting on intentions or actions or activities. And the other thing that strikes me as well is that, there's a real change in work models and in the evolution of employee expectations. And of course, if you look at an industry like mining that's already been facing a skill shortage for a decade or more, that is clearly facing more of a skills shortage in the next decade, then the implications become strategic. And I think for mining, the whole discussion around the flexibility of work, the nature of work, employee expectations is going to continue to cause a lot of disruption to management and promotion models. And a lot of the issues that were previously seen as group specific, flexibility of work or variable career paths, were usually discussed as part of, women in mining and the emergence of diversity. Now, this is a general issue that concerns everybody. So I think leadership in mining is going to have to contend with that context more and more. And when you combine that with, of course, the technological evolution of the nature of work in mining, we could see some significant transformation.
I think you're right. You've got to walk the walk, as Mark Cutifani says all the time, with regards to responsibility of leadership with mining companies. But Lara, we've recently seen a broadening of the pool of mining industry stakeholders, and one of these is the end consumer, a stakeholder which mining and metal companies have historically not been especially close. So what do you think? I mean, in terms of the extent that the end consumer sentiment has the ability to impact the industry going forward?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think the jury is not out on that yet.
Yeah.
But, well, we always say, look, if it's not grown, it's mined. And more consumers are making that connection of, oh, I have a cell phone, oh, I engage with technology, oh, I engage with my world around me. And the raw materials come from somewhere. I haven't planted a tree to get it. I've mined it. And these are the so-called evil mining companies that are destroying the planet, which we're advocating for. And so those connections are happening, and they're not simple, and there has been pushback. Now, that pushback needs to come in the context of, again, sustainability, economic development. You can't stop all progress. The reality is that a lot of these metals that are going into our new technologies, which the same consumer is advocating to have, does carry with it issues of radioactivity, issues of environmental concerns, the fact that they're not mined necessarily in desirable jurisdictions. It does open those floodgates, as it were. And now the question comes is, how do we get the balance between the consumer pushback, which is growing, and it is very real. People want to see responsible supply chains. This idea of responsible supply chains has come forward. But there's also reality on the ground, and reality of the ground is that countries where a lot of these commodities come are not pretty, are not, you can't have these, what I'd call armchair legislations, of these blanket legislations, where you say there must be no child labor and there must be upliftment of poverty. Yes, these are all very good ideals. How do we put these into practice? Of course, nobody wants to see a child laboring in a mine. They want to see children in schools. But in many regions, this is not the reality. How do we bridge this while still sort of getting what we need to and progressing the technology which the same consumers also want to have? And this is the trick in ESG. ESG is not just about economic sustainability and governance. It's also a question of how do we balance the different stakeholders.
I think so. I mean, that is the billion-dollar question: is the balance and how it's actually enforced. And you mentioned the world's most conflict and corruption-prone countries, where a lot of mining activities are taking place. So Graeme, on that, as a significant percentage of mining is undertaken in these areas, from my research, it's shown that the licensing phase of new mining projects and expansion projects are particularly susceptible, given the frequent touch points with government and high business stakes. So given this context, what are the priorities in the face of persuasive governance and also corruption risks?
Well, in the jurisdictions where I operate, corruption risks are extremely high. I operate in Tanzania, Mozambique, Angola, Indonesia, a number of interesting jurisdictions. But I think that we have found that if you approach a project correctly, and that is with due respect to ESG principles, then eventually it may be a bit slower, but eventually you get to where you want to go without being ravaged too much by government demands. On the other hand, mining faces the problem of nationalization. Governments do see profits emerging, or they think they see profits emerging. What they don't recognize is the number of people who are employed in producing a mineral commodity, nor do they see the villages around mines where responsible ESG miners have helped develop, building schools, developing agricultural tracts. The governments don't care about that. All they see is extracting their form of dividend from the mining operation. And that in itself acts as a deterrent to responsible mining. So therein lies the problem. The problem is one of, I think, education, where if you can get in and you can train government officers into having some form of responsibility and some form of nationalism rather than nationalization, then I think you can drive projects forward in a very good way. The problem is communications. You've got stakeholders, you've got shareholders, you've got the employees of the mine, you have the villages around the mines. they're all stakeholders, and it's up to the mining company to work out new paradigms in terms of communicating to all those stakeholders in different ways. You don't communicate to your shareholders the same way as you do to the villagers living around you. You put employment programs in for the villagers, and you educate them in what you're trying to do. The shareholders, they need to see profits and things emerging from the mining industry. So it is very much a matter, and I fully agree, it's a matter of balance. You need to balance the stakeholders' expectations, the government expectations, given a lack of governance in a lot of those developing jurisdictions. And you've got to assist in showing governance in your own operation as an example. So I think all these things are very important in putting a mining operation together in a sustainable manner.
I agree. I mean, I think the communications aspect is vital, and I'll come on to that shortly, because I think that is an ongoing challenge for a lot of mining companies at the moment. But Ludivine, just another thing with regards to new mining projects around the world that are being rebranded as clean, green, and vital to climate action. In some instances, these may be valid claims, but in others could be classified as greenwashing. So how do stakeholders guard against greenwashing and hold companies accountable to their environmental commitments?
Good question, of course, because it's always part of the risk and opportunity that we need to anticipate. I think I'm going to rebound a little bit from what Graeme was just saying. Amongst the stakeholder groups, I think employees have a certain specific position, because they're both in and out, because they know your operation, particularly on-site employees, they know your operation from the inside out, and they connect to the reality around projects, around a company, directly. And again, I think this is a global trend that's going to have a specific effect in mining. The rise of employee activism, and frankly, the concerning trend of leaking and massive recourse to the court of public opinion, is something that's going to become increasingly important, including in the countries where we do this business. There's a lot of civil society movement around finding internal information and leveraging it in negotiations or positioning around a mining company. And I think that's only going to increase. It's already been the case very strongly around other industries, including oil and gas. There's no reason for this trend not to increase significantly around mining companies. Again, I think it highlights the risk of the disconnect between corporate headquarters, where there's a certain message, a lot of probably earnest positioning, and operations which are sometimes completely on their own planet in terms of rules and application and connection to stakeholders. And maybe also just rebounding a little bit on what Lara was saying earlier, I think there's going to be increasing regulation around a lot of these stakes. Donors, policy shapers, policy shops, whether you're talking about, the World Bank Climate Smart Mining Initiative, IGF Mining coming out with a whole suite of guidance and tools for regulators around closure, financial management of, closure provisions, environmental issues. All of these are tools that are looking to position regulators much more strongly around mining. Again, with the view that in many emerging countries, civil society feels that the previous mining boom did not trickle down, did not create economic and social benefit. So I think the level of scrutiny will increase. The tools are increasing because there are stronger policy shapers that are backing regulators and producing countries. And I think it's extremely important for mining as an industry to be part of how that policy is being shaped. So, you know, there's a lot of guidance and positioning coming out of ICMM and other industry organizations. Ideally, we need to be engaging more and more and more where that policy is shaped. I'm not sure that in the past we've always done that successfully.
No, I agree. And in terms of, Lara, we've just been talking about education, and what role do you think does the mining industry have in providing more of an equitable access to education and skills training to enhance the sort of digital talent pool, which I think is another aspect that can help with this?
Thank you very much for your question. I just want to, while we're still on the other topic, just say one more thing, also
Sure.
bouncing from Graeme. I do believe there is the ability to create a sustainable environment for a mine, regardless of the country. And I'll give one example of this. Alphaman Resources, which is a relatively small operation, it's in the DRC. It produces tin. It produces tin in an extremely sustainable way. They should be applauded at the community benefits that they've given to that community. But it was certainly not an easy road. And I think it took them around 9 years to get into production. A lot of it was because of the issues around the community and just being in the middle of the DRC. One thing they did have was patient capital. They're backed by Denham Capital. They have Traxys has got a stake in there. I think Sprott Group was in there as well. So, you know, I don't know where this notion came that mining isn't a long-term gain and investors should expect, but they also want to see profits quickly. And the reality is that to create these environments, especially in challenging places, requires ongoing engagement. And often you don't see the profits immediately, but when you do, you start seeing super profits. I mean, right now you've got the tin price at an all-time high. They're producing well. They're going to be 4% of the global tin market. That took time. That took community engagement. It is a sustainable mine. We don't expect them to go down. We don't expect a strike because of what they've been able to achieve in that community. So it will now benefit those shareholders, but those shareholders have to be patient. And that I think is key. It's not just about aligning money to governance principles. It's aligning money to governance principles and having the patience to see that through to create an ESG environment. To get onto your question around education of employees and stakeholders, this is actually this is the key to my heart because I'm a teacher. In a previous life I was a teacher, and I left teaching, and the first job I tried to do was to educate the mine workers. And what I thought of is there were so many at the time. There was a lot of fatalities in the South African gold mining environments, and if you analyze the data, the fatalities were miners that were new to that particular mine. And that's where a lot of it was happening. And if you went further, it was, if you were in boom markets, there was a big switch, or there was a big incentive to just go and line up at the mine that was paying 20 Rand a day more. So it was this marginal benefit would move mine workers from one mine to another. And those were the mine workers that were most susceptible to an accident or a fatality. So what I wanted to do was educate them to give a profession to these mine workers and incentivize them to stay on a particular mine because they were going to get an education. And that would have been great. But again, it came back to it came back to money at the end of the day, stakeholders, bribery. They saw an opportunity, and eventually it just didn't happen. Now, if we had more of those education programs, I was I would suggest we probably see a lot less fatalities, and we would also solve the problem of employment and keeping miners on the mine for the duration of the boom. And on the other side is if they came away with a profession after a 5 or 6 year boom, because mining is not going to change. Mining is always going to be cyclical. There would be something for these people to do when the time came for that mine to eventually close or shutter for that period. And I don't think anybody's looking at education in that way. And perhaps we should be. A lot of the education right now is around skills, around health, it's upliftment, but how do we truly uplift the mine workers so that we get a skilled labor force? And that I think is really critical, not just to ESG principles, but just being a good corporate citizen and upliftment of nations.
I think that's absolutely right. And at the moment, I don't think mining companies are doing enough on that. And Graham, we're covering a lot of subject matter here. We don't have a lot of time. So please do add some comments on what Lara and Ludivine have been answering on some of my questions. And that's absolutely fine. The one question I have for you, if you do want to add some comments on what the other panelists are saying, the question is, I think there's a big, clear trust deficit between the global mining industry and society in general. I think that's what Lara's just been discussing. And I think, just to quote Mark Cutifani, he said, the mining brand continues to stand for menace. So how can that change? And in terms of build back trust, particularly as mining companies pivot to meet future socio environmental challenges and opportunities?
It's a very good point. I think Mark Twain said, a mine is a hole in the ground owned by a liar. So even 150 years ago, mining wasn't the most popular means of development, mainly because mining companies themselves have focused on their shareholders. Publicly listed companies have focused on their shareholders, and private companies have kept things very private, and there's been no flow of information. Look, I'll give you an example of a mine I have in Tanzania. We employ 500 Tanzanians and 1 expatriate to run the whole mining operation. It's the largest of its particular type in Eastern Africa, and we supply a number of countries in Eastern Africa. The conditions in Tanzania have in the past been horrific, very, very difficult, but we, for instance, we form a women's group at the mine, or all the local villagers put them together as a women's group and give them the catering contract. We bring in cooks to teach them to cook. They supply the food. We reclaim our mined out areas and we grow the food in the reclaimed areas. And they grow tomatoes and cauliflower and all sorts of things. We assist in that, and they feed our workers. So it's building that in the community, creating something is sustainable like that, which is very important because the workers talk with them, we give them uniforms, and that brings them more into the corporate side of things. So the company becomes part of the community. Now, this might not work in Western countries or more developed countries, but when you're looking at the DRC, which was Lara's example, or you look at Tanzania or Mozambique or those countries, it's the little things which count. And I think that when you look at bringing the community into the mining area and also providing education, you're training people to be engineers or to be valuable workers within the mine's workforce. You're creating jobs, you're bringing something to these villages. And as wealth filters into the villages, it's an interesting thing. Everyone has a hand phone. You go into Africa and you drive around the villages, and in each village, in the headman's hut, there's a solar panel. And the solar panel is just there to charge hand phones because they do their banking, they do their communications, they do their networking, the digitization. Africa is one of the most digitized areas in the world. So it's really, you've got to forget the past. And this pandemic has been a good rationale to start to look at new paradigms in communications, new paradigms in governance, and new paradigms in social responsibility, or the ES part of the ESG. That becomes very, very important. If you want a smooth mining operation, it's critical. The tin mining in DRC, it's a compact operation, so it operates within that area and it doesn't have too many problems, except its problems come once it exports its product and has to go through the national government. And that means that really, as the point which Ludivine was making, that we have to train and educate the national governments or the mines departments in national governments to look at regulation in a fair and impartial way in which it's meant to be looked at, rather than as a means of extracting further income, which either in their own pockets or in the coffers of the government. So, you know, there's a lot of things that need to be managed better in the future. And I think that the pandemic and the post-pandemic world, you do have the opportunity of doing that. I speak briefly from a banker's point of view, because I'm also happen to be a banker, we have funding, which is green funding. We have to choose green projects. We won't fund a mine that is either fossil fuel based, and I'm a fossil fuel miner, but we won't finance fossil fuels. We look very carefully at the environmental aspect, but now we're looking closer and closer at the ESG, and whether you use the World Bank's interpretation of ESG or look at the World Economic Forum interpretation of ESG, there's many different interpretations. They seem to be coming closer and closer together. So eventually we'll have a natural definition of ESG, which may prevent the rip-off companies, if you pardon the expression, that do get into the mining industry with glossy promises and with no substance. So I think that is one thing which is becoming closer and closer. And I can say from the banking industry, there's a lot of pressures coming into the banking industry to enforce that sort of thing with the mining companies. So, you know, there's a few comments on that.
Thank you very much. And I think you're absolutely right. The relationship between local government and national government has to improve for the mining sector. As you noted, we're slowly running out of time, but I've got one more question for Ludivine, and it's about communication. And of course, if you have other comments, Graeme or Lara, on how to communicate in terms of how do you think the mining companies need to improve their communications? Because at the moment, with regards to ESG, with regards to the spheres of environmental stewardship and social responsibility, they don't really communicate particularly well. So really, to all three of you, and please keep your answers a bit brief, how do you think they can improve their communications?
Thanks, Charles. I think the number one recommendation that I would give today to executives and boards who are actually doing the work, who are actually putting in the effort and the long-termism that Lara was referring to, is to avoid the noise or cut through the noise. If you're going at ESG because you want to tick every box and keep investors happy, then by necessity, that's not driving strategic decision making. If, however, you know, as a company, you truly define a purpose, then there's going to be 2 or 3 real points where you can actually drive outcome that are going to come up. Focus on those, be consistent. And when you talk about them, you'll have something true to talk about, but also the authenticity of what you'll be talking about will make a difference compared to dozens of pages of nice forms and, you know, a pretty little reassuring signature at the bottom. So I think coming back to basics of thinking strategically and being accountable for real outcomes is going to make a difference in terms of how some CEOs and some boards are communicating on this. And we're already seeing that difference. And I think that will become a competitive advantage even more than it is today.
And Lara, anything further to add on that?
Yes, I think Ludivine is right when you say let's go back to basics. I remember when I worked for a diversified mining fund, we had some operations in Zambia, and it was just such a ESG was just this thing you had to get done. I remember we said, okay, well, we'll build a pool and the community will be happy, and of course all the children will enjoy the pool, and that was the case. But all the children enjoyed the pool, but there was no school, there was no education. The whole community sort of was left behind, and we employed as fewer people as possible to maximize profit. So that is not something you can get away with anymore. That is not looking at an operation in a sustainable way. That is looking at something in a short-term way, and mining is not a short-term gain. So really, as miners, we have an opportunity to be in it for the long term and to get the basics right, to make sure that the community around us is educated or improving, that there is nourishment, as Graeme said, that there's so many little things that we can do to improve lives in a way that will continue beyond the mine. And the saddest thing is that when a mine closes, it takes 4,000 people with it, and all the management, and the place becomes a ghost town. How nice it would be for an ex-mining place to not be a ghost town because you've got a vibrancy in a community that you've created. And that's something, when you're mining for 30 years, that's a long time to be able to get the basics right. And you can do far more than to build a pool. Yeah.
Thanks, Lara. And Graeme, lastly from yourself, is there any further comment you'd like to add on how do mining companies communicate better on the back of how the changing world with the ESG is now evolving?
I think Lara and Ludivine have put it extremely well. And I think it's very, very true. I think that one has to look at shareholder communications. And I said, and as I said before, there has to be an official interpretation of what ESG really means, and that's got to become part of corporate policy. But automatically, companies on the ground, operationally, have got to be doing CSR. I'm a bit old-fashioned, I call it CSR, and that's working with the villages around them, working with the communities around them, employing from the communities around them, educating the communities around them. It's a long-term thing. At the same time, governments or government institutions or Department of Mines in certain aid programs can increase the governance skills of government departments in many of those developing countries. So it's not a single road into this. It's a multifaceted sort of approach to these things. But I think it's got to be put together, and the good companies are the ones that do it. There's a hell of a lot of bad companies out there who don't do it. But the ones that do it are the ones that will be there for the long term. So I think that both Lara and Ludivine's comments are very correct.
Absolutely right. I think it's going to become an absolutely an imperative way of running a business, especially in the mining sector. Thank you, all of you, for your time today. It's such a big subject. It's only going to get bigger and bigger, and so it should. Thank you both all for your time, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charles.